InFi, episode 40.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I'm going to be speaking with Antoni, who is a research fellow and public finance economist with the Heritage Foundation. He's been published in many outlets, including the Daily Caller, Fox News and Fox Business, Wall Street Journal, National Review, CNBC, Washington Times, and so forth. And of course, he's a frequent guest on radio programs. He previously was an economist with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and he's got a master's and doctoral degree in economics. So EJ and I are going to be speaking on the labor market specifically, but then we're also going to move on to some other areas that he's written on, just in terms of some of his pop columns. And of course, I'll link to all this stuff, folks. Again, you're listening to episode 40. Specifically on the labor markets, we keep hearing how great the Biden economy is. And so I ask EJ to go through those numbers and see if he thinks some of them may be misleading or if they measure them improperly. So with that teaser, here we go, my discussion with EJ Antoni. EJ, welcome to the InFi podcast.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I can safely say you are the most well-dressed guest we've had to date.
Thank you kindly.
So we appreciate, I don't know if that's just what you wear in the office or that's your podcast outfit, but very good. So maybe I would have already explained a little bit to the listeners of your background, but just briefly for those who aren't familiar with your work, can you just explain what your role is and what your areas of expertise are before we dive into the main content?
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. So I'm a public finance economist, which to the layman basically just means that I kind of make up numbers every day. Essentially what I do is I analyze how the government gets money and how the government spends money and the various ways in which that affects you and I, basically all the negative ways in which that affects you and I. So chief among the things that I research are the Federal Reserve, since that is a key component of government finance today and is also a key source of taxation via the hidden tax of inflation.
Okay, great. And then you also, though, have written analyses of the labor market, jobs reports, things like that. And that's the specific reason I wanted you on today. So I don't know what the best place to start. You want to just, let me put it this way. A lot of the messaging coming out from the Biden administration is, don't listen to Fox News. These people are crazy. Look at how low the unemployment rate is. This is amazing. And certainly if you break it down, even among certain communities, the unemployment rate is at the 40-year low, something like that. And the economy's doing great. Wages are rising faster than inflation, prices and so forth. And so everything's great. And yet I've seen some analysis from you to look at these numbers from a slightly different angle and say, actually, there's storm clouds on the horizon.
Well, that unemployment rate is probably a perfect place to start today. And people need to remember with statistics like the unemployment rate that this thing is a ratio, right? It's not simply as if we just add up all of the people who are unemployed and there's our figure. No, it's an unemployment rate. So it's the unemployed divided by the labor force. But that means that you can change the rate by either changing the number of people who are employed or by adjusting that labor force. And so what we saw during COVID was literally millions of people just leave the workforce. And what's interesting is that almost none of them have returned. Some did, but not that many. So we've seen people enter the labor force for the first time, but a lot of people just simply left and never came back. So that means we're missing millions of people right now from that unemployment rate calculation. So what's interesting is that we have various ways of tracking, all right, how far are we below our growth trend? How far are we below things like our employment trend, et cetera? And the Bureau of Labor Statistics even has a category they keep track of specifically called not in the labor force. So we have a lot of different methodologies we can use to say, all right, if we had the same people who exited the labor force, if we had them in the labor force today, what would that unemployment rate actually look like? Because obviously none of these people have jobs, but they're not counted as unemployed today. So instead of an unemployment rate below 4%, you have an unemployment rate somewhere between 6.5% and 7.7%, again, depending on which methodology you prefer to use. Now, that's not catastrophic, right? This is not Great Depression level unemployment we're talking about here, but 7% unemployment, that's certainly at home in your typical recession. So I think that kind of gives people a better idea of where the labor market is today. And it also lines up a lot closer with poll results when we ask people, how do you feel about the labor market? How do you feel about your own personal situation within the labor market? Those responses tend to be pretty bad, and they tend to be more in line with something you would see, again, in a garden variety recession.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we'll flash up here on the screen for those who are watching the video, the labor force participation rate. So I'm just looking here at coming from the BLS, and that was trending upward in from the 60s onward, presumably because more women were entering the labor force, and that it peaked at the high, like 67% or so, going into the original dot-com crash. It came down, and then it just fell off a cliff after the financial crisis during the Obama years. And then, as you say, EJ, it fell very sharply during the lockdown, obviously, and then it started coming back up, but it still has not gotten back to the pre-pandemic level. And even that is still way below where it was before the financial crisis. So I suppose, some people would say, oh, well, the population's getting older, and so we shouldn't, there's that element involved. But anyway, do you want to just comment on that?
Oh, certainly. We essentially have a whole host of very bad public policy decisions which are encouraging people not to work today. And some of that would be things like the expansion of welfare. And I don't just mean the expansion of welfare in terms of the benefits that you receive, but also who is eligible. The reduction of work requirements I think is a great case study of how a policy that, even if it has the best of intentions, can have absolutely terrible results and can really trap people into these cycles of poverty, where if they were to go out and get a job and earn a little bit of money, they would lose more in welfare benefits than they gain in income. And so it doesn't really make sense for a lot of people to ever get off the dole. And unfortunately, we are really seeing that today. But you also have an interesting case where the number of people on disability has absolutely exploded. And it wasn't initially in 2020, but it was in around the middle of 2021. And I've seen a couple of different empirical studies done, some of which say that this is from quote unquote long COVID. Others attribute it to injuries related to vaccines. But whatever the case may be, the huge uptick in people on disability has also removed folks from the labor force, and those people are likely to never return.
This might be getting a little bit into the weeds, but that's one of the things we do here. So I see this piece that you came out on May 3rd, 2024, saying new government data shows the economy may be losing jobs. And you talk about the BED, the Business Employment Dynamics module that the BLS publishes, and you're just explaining that versus the more conventional numbers. Can you just speak at least on the high level as to what that is and the kind of arguments you were making?
Oh, certainly. So we want to distinguish between these different surveys that the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, publishes. So every month, the BLS will publish one set of data that is from a survey of about 660,000 businesses. And that's where we get these monthly job numbers that we hear so much about. And not only have those numbers proven to be pretty inaccurate in that they are consistently revised down over the last year, but on top of that, if we look at broader surveys that cover not just several 100,000 businesses, but cover several million businesses, the numbers are totally different. In fact, this latest one, the Business Employment Dynamics that you mentioned, shows that the economy isn't even adding jobs anymore. It's been losing them. Also, we just got additional data from a quarterly census that the BLS uses, and that, although it's very delayed, meaning we don't get the numbers as quickly as we do with like these monthly surveys, The quarterly census is a great data set because of how wide-ranging it is. It covers millions of businesses and over 95% of American jobs. So it's pretty accurate compared to a survey of just a few 100,000 businesses. What does that show? It shows that job growth last year was overstated by almost 800,000. In other words, 1 in every 4 jobs that was supposedly created last year never even existed. It's as if you took 3 months of job gains from 2024 and just simply wiped them off the calendar. So we have a lot of conflicting data right now, but what we would typically consider to be the better or at least more reliable data sources are painting a far less rosy picture of the economy than the other data, the ones that unfortunately get the most headlines.
Now, on that, just to understand your perspective, the headline figures, the ones that you say in retrospect looks like, at least as of last year, may have greatly overstated the job growth. It's not that the Biden administration changed what statistics they were reporting, right? It's just the one that was normal to be used has these limitations. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, to be clear, this is a good point. To be clear, I don't personally have any evidence of wrongdoing at the BLS. I don't even know anyone at the BLS who works on these figures. So I can't say that there is anything unethical going on here, but there are a lot of mathematical flukes which BLS should be aware of and they should be taking care of, but they're not. And that's helping to produce a lot of these statistical anomalies. I can give you one very good example, which is the birth-death model. And it doesn't have to do anything with human births and deaths, where we adjust the population based on those factors, but rather births and deaths of businesses. So because these monthly job estimates can't actually survey every single business in the country and get a true census of the number of payrolls, instead, one of the things that they rely on is applications to start new businesses and also information on businesses that are being destroyed. In other words, firms that are going out of business. Now, the reason that's important is because when a company goes out of business, all of the jobs there at, all of the people who used to be employed at that business, those are gone. But likewise, when a new business starts, that is, we can assume, going to employ people. Now, how many people is that going to employ? What kinds of jobs are these going to be? Those are all assumptions that we have to make when we're trying to actually estimate each month how many jobs are added or lost in total in the economy. And so they have to rely on applications to start new businesses. Well, those things have been incredibly elevated post-COVID because of all the firms that went out of business during government-imposed lockdowns in 2020 and even well into 2021. So because the applications to start new businesses have been abnormally elevated, the BLS has been assuming this huge amount of job growth, which just simply hasn't materialized. And what the reason I say they should know better is because this effect has been well known for quite a while now. The data is out there. Anyone can verify it. I'm not saying something that's proprietary information here. And yet the BLS has done nothing to correct the problem. And that's just one of the reasons why these monthly statistics are continuously revised down as better data becomes available and confirms that the initial estimates were just too overly optimistic.
Okay, so I get it here. It's just more to understand exactly the situation, at least as you see it. The model, the birth-death models and so forth that they're using, if I understood you, you're saying going through the COVID, the lockdowns, and then relaxing those constraints, that type of model is giving spurious results, and they should have known that. But is that the same type of model that was being used in 2019? That's what I'm trying to isolate. Is it that the current techniques they use to report the figures to the press and to put on the BLS press releases, is that what they were using all along? And just because of some weird circumstances having to do with COVID and other factors, they're giving really bad output right now? Or is it that they actually have been tweaking the models all along, and one might think that they're picking parameters in a way to make the numbers look better?
Sure. Well, most of the methodologies at BLS haven't actually changed over the last 5 years. And so for the most part, the same procedures from 2019 have been followed through 2024. Now, are there a few tweaks that have been made? Are there some substantive changes along the way? Sure, absolutely. But most of the drivers behind these, what I would say are erroneous numbers, have been in place that entire time. So as you said, it's much more circumstantial than anything else. But again, as statisticians, when we observe these types of anomalies, we need to be aware of them, and then we need to act to correct them. If you had an assumption that worked fine in 2019, but no longer works in 2024, then you need to change your assumption. You owe that to the American people.
Yeah. And the distinction I'm drawing here, EJ, like, for example, Paul Krugman, who is one of my favorite go-to guys as far as people who are usually on the other side of an issue from me, is like he's on social media posting stuff every once in a while about, well, if you look at the CPI taking out food, energy, transportation, and housing, Biden's crushing it. You know what I mean? Like this, don't listen to Fox News. And so I was saying something like there, even though, yes, there is a case to be made about, oh, well, you want to strip out volatile things and blah, blah, look at the core under. But I know if Donald Trump were president and the headline CPI was rising at the way it's been doing under this last term, that Krugman wouldn't be using that metric. So that's what I mean, that, yeah, people can come up with ways of massaging these numbers based on what they want the outcome to be. But just to be clear, so you're saying it's not so much that the people, the BLS, threw out their old methodology and brought in a new one to try to make Biden look better. It's just because of recent circumstances, the way they've been doing it is really, like, those assumptions are not holding up. And so the numbers coming out of this procedure are much more misleading now than they would have been 5 years ago.
Exactly. But you bring up a very good point, which is that a lot of people are purposely misusing this data, which BLS is presenting. Paul Krugman is great. If you just remove all of the components of CPI that increase, then it turns out CPI is not increasing. Amazing. Who would have thought, right? If you get rid of inflation, there's no more inflation. Imagine that. If we just remove all of the necessities that people have to buy, food, shelter, clothing, it turns out the cost of living isn't going up. I mean, it'd be funny if it weren't so sad, right? Because this truly is a cost of living crisis, and the American people, especially the middle class, truly are suffering today. But you can always take this to the bank. You can always be sure what components of CPI are increasing the most, because those are always the things that Paul Krugman refuses to mention in the latest inflation report. So if one particular thing happens to increase less than average, that's what he highlights for the month, and then completely ignores everything else. Why? Because at the end of the day, he's a political apparatchik, right? At the end of the day, he's there to serve a narrative. He's not there in service of the numbers. He has no devotion to the truth. He has devotion to the Democrat Party. And I don't begrudge him for that. That's fine. He can do what he wants to do. This is America after all. But if you're interested in the truth, if you're interested in what the data actually say, then he's probably not your best source of information.
Okay, well, great. And I definitely agree with that last statement you made. Maybe we just transition now, since you mentioned at the start that your expertise is public finance. So here on this podcast, I've been doing a lot against pointing out the problems with modern monetary theory, or MMT. And let me just ask you, big picture, one of the main MMT talking points is to say this idea about, we can't afford programs, we don't have enough money, the deficit is too high, or the debt to GDP is too high. This is all just scare tactics. It's either deliberate obfuscation or these people are just idiots. Because don't people realize when we're talking about the US or the UK or Japan, these are monetary sovereigns. They can issue their own currency. So there's no issue of, can we, quote, pay for it? Or can we afford it? Or can we find the money? It's just a matter of real resource usage. And, if the government spends too much, maybe price inflation kicks up. But let's stop talking about it in terms of traditional financial descriptions. So what's your general reaction to that kind of mentality?
When I used to teach a class on money and banking, we would go through what I would classify as the 7 different schools, essentially, of discretionary monetary policy. And I would explain to the students that, look, the first 6 that we're going to go through are all in their own way defensible. None of them are perfect, because discretionary monetary policy is not perfect. But the one which is completely indefensible is MMT, is modern monetary theory. So one of the things that...
Can I say, so for the listeners, EJ, can you explain, what do you mean by the term discretionary monetary policy? What does that mean?
Oh, certainly. So when you have a central bank like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, et cetera, each of these institutions have discretion over how they're handling monetary policy. So instead of having a monetary policy like we had before the Federal Reserve, where currency is issued by private institutions and the amount of the issuance is strictly based on what kind of precious metal reserves, like gold, that they have. In other words, we can only issue a certain number of dollars for a certain amount of gold sitting in our vaults. Once you get away from that system and you get towards central banking, they being the central bankers, are in charge of increasing or decreasing the money supply at their discretion. And they will do it for various reasons. But essentially with MMT, they completely ignore the very first lesson of economics, which is scarcity. And essentially, if something is not scarce, then it can't have value. This is illustrated very well in the diamond water paradox lesson in economics, where the price for diamonds is much, much higher than the price for water. But that doesn't really make much sense at first, because the utility of diamonds is actually very, very low compared to the utility of water. You will pay much more for water over the course of your lifetime than you will for diamonds. Why? Because the total utility that you get from that water being able to survive is much higher than the utility you could possibly get from those diamonds. So how do we explain the differential in price? It's because demand is only one side of the equation, supply is the other. And it's the interaction of those two that actually gives us a price level. So because water is so abundant and because diamonds are so scarce, that dictates a much higher price for diamonds. Now, we may need a new lesson after a few years, because we're seeing synthetic diamonds now become quite popular, which is greatly increasing the supply. So the price of diamonds will probably come down substantially in the future. But whatever the case may be, for at least the time being, it makes sense to use this analogy. So MMT advocates completely ignore that entire lesson. And they say, look, we can just print as much money as we want. And that completely ignores the fact that there has to be a demand for dollars. You can't just have a supply. There has to be a demand. And it's going to be, again, that interaction of supply and demand that determines the price of dollars. In other words, what a dollar is worth, which means what a dollar can buy. And so if you're just going to blow out the supply of dollars, then what happens? Well, you haven't changed the demand. And so the supply relative to demand has increased, which means the price of the dollar, in other words, what the dollar can buy, goes down. This is precisely what we have seen over the last several years. The MMTers had their way, beginning really in 2020. They got everything that they wanted. And they said, oh, look, no inflation. Well, inflation takes a little bit of time to kick in. It doesn't happen immediately. And effectively, we have relearned the same lesson that we had to learn in the 1970s, which is if you print trillions upon trillions of dollars to try to finance these massive government deficits, you will get runaway inflation. That's precisely what we're suffering with today.
Yeah, and on that, so folks, I'll link on a different podcast that I'm on. We went through this claim because you may know, EJ, like Stephanie Kelton and some other MMT people, they're currently running victory laps saying we totally called it on inflation. It was transitory. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I went and dug clips off the top of my head right now. I don't remember exactly when it was from, but it was like when consumer price inflation was ticking up and had broken into like the 5% year over year. And Stephanie Kelton was on Bloomberg or something, and they were asking her, and she was like, oh yeah, this is transitory. This is just supply shocks, bottlenecks from the lockdown. I mean, so it's kind of like, what would have to happen for you guys to admit you were wrong about it? You know what I mean? It's to say transitory inflation doesn't mean as long as it at some point comes down, then it's transitory. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany eventually came down, so I guess that was just transitory. You know what I mean? So the way they're using this term is like
transitory in the sense that it transitioned higher.
Right. Right. So on that score, again, that they do often give the caveat like, hey, we're not just saying run the money printer and no problem. Like, no, we know there's inflation. And so it's like, okay. And so then when inflation did rear its ugly head, the worst, that the U.S. has experienced 40 years, you'd think they'd say, okay, let's pull it. No, they're not saying the government needs to stop spending so much. So anyway, it's interesting to call their bluff, as it were. Do you mind, can you just bang through what the other 6 schools of thought were when you were teaching that? Because I can imagine what some of them would be, but I'm not sure I know exactly which 6 you have in mind.
Oh, certainly. And some of this is, I would say, are a little roughly named. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the schools is neoclassical. And there are plenty of economists who would say, I am a neoclassical economist, but they wouldn't quite abide by all the principles in that school of monetary thought. So give me a little bit of rope here, I would say.
Sure thing. Yeah.
So the first 2 would be classical and Keynesian. And then after that, you have monetarist, which is a little bit of a combination of both of those. The way I like to put it is that they look at the classicalists as being right in the long run, but the Keynesians as being right in the short run. And then after that, you have neo-Keynesian and neoclassicalist, and then finally an anti-fractional reserve system.
Okay, very good. Can you, as we transition here, I'm just looking at your archive, and you had a piece, just to put you on the spot here, so hopefully you remember, on May 9th saying green housing mandates are pushing Americans more into the red. Can you give us the takeaway on that one?
Oh, certainly. This is really troubling because it comes at a time when home ownership costs are already just at stratospheric levels. And now we're just adding insult to injury here. Essentially, what the Biden administration is doing is they are imposing energy requirements on a certain segment of the housing market. But the problem is that builders, when they are building homes, don't necessarily know whether or not these homes are going to be sold according to a certain program. They don't know if buyers are going to use a certain type of financing, for example, to purchase these homes. And so what happens when you put these regulations in place is that it effectively becomes a blanket regulation that all home builders are going to have to follow. And what's really crazy here is that these so-called energy saving requirements, these green energy requirements, they're not even cost effective. What I mean by that is it'd be one thing if you were to say, okay, you have to insulate a home. Yes, it's going to cost more upfront, but within only a year or two, the home buyer is going to gain back all of that extra cost. And then it's just cost savings from there on out for the rest of the time they own the home. Well, that makes sense only at first, but you can take that to extremes where it doesn't make sense at all. And that's where we get this regulation here. It will take over 90 years for a homeowner to ever recoup the cost associated with these regulations. In other words, these energy requirements just simply don't make sense. I mean, think about it. Imagine a young couple buying one of these homes today, and they have a child right when they buy that home. According to life expectancy, not just the parents, but that child is going to live his or her entire life and then pass away before the homeowner ever breaks even on these additional costs that went into buying that home. I mean, this is insane. And yet, this is the kind of things that are being foisted upon the American people that are helping to drive up not just the cost of home ownership, but the cost of living. It is genuinely sad, again, especially when you consider that this is being thrown on top of the backs of the American people at a time when they are already so financially strained.
That dovetails your analysis with, I used to do a lot of work on the energy sector and specifically with climate change issues. And you're right, a lot of these regulations, they're very paternalistic and they try to pass a cost benefit test because these regulations have to go through that. It's just part of the government procedures when they impose something like this. And they can always come up with some crazy justification, like you say, like using a very low discount rate and things like that. But what I would always say is, let's say you're right. In other words, folks, so they would be arguing this is actually going to benefit homeowners. It's going to save them money in the long run. So there's an effectively negative cost to these regulations for some of them. Like EJ is saying that, if you get more fuel efficient things, yes, it's a higher upfront cost, but then your bills going forward are lower permanently, and therefore you end up making money. And so it's a good thing. We're forcing businesses and homeowners to make money. And so my point was, if you actually believe that, if that's actually correct, and there's not important things you're leaving out of the analysis, like access to credit markets for one thing, then why do you need to force people to do it? Why don't you just put it up on your website or, email the packet to all the CFOs of the major companies, and they'll be like, there's money on the table here. We didn't realize. Thank you, Department of Energy or whoever it is, for giving us this information. We'll go install energy efficient windows and insulation starting next week because we're going to save money according to you. And obviously the reason they have to force people to do it is there's something missing in the analysis.
Exactly, 100%. And sure enough, if we look at the markets where we don't have this level of government intervention, of government regulation, those are the markets that are most efficient. Those are the markets that are most likely to deliver to customers the products and services they want at lower prices. Flat screen TVs and monitors are a really good example of this, where the cost for those products has come down tremendously over the last several years, over the course of a decade. And yet it was not because of government fiat that any of those things happened. It was because of innovation in the private sector. It was because of competition. And a lot of the features that consumers really love about things like smart TVs, for example, and their internet connectivity, those things weren't mandated by the government. They were things that businessmen decided, hey, I think customers would really like this. I'm going to put in the work to make this product a reality, and I'm going to take the risk that I think it's going to sell. And sure enough, those people have done very, very well for themselves. And the American people who have benefited from being able to have access to those products, they have done very well likewise. Why? How do we know that? Because they were more than happy to part with their money in order to get that product from that businessman. And so that's just, I think, a very good example of how the free market, if left to itself, if unfettered by the government, again, will deliver what consumers want. Why? Not because a businessman is charitable. It's because it's in his own best interest to do so. I think it was the economist Thomas Sowell. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It was Walter Williams, the late economist Walter Williams, who gave the example. Why is it that a Texas rancher or an Idaho potato farmer is getting up before dawn to tend to his cattle or to tend to his field so that New Yorkers can have steak and potatoes for dinner? Is it because he likes New Yorkers? Of course not. New Yorkers don't even like New Yorkers. So why on earth is he doing this? Why on earth is he breaking his back? It's because the New Yorkers are paying him to do it. It's because it's in his own best interest to do it. By serving his fellow man, he's able to make money. Conversely, how does a bureaucrat make money? Typically by harming his fellow man. And these regulations on housing are a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and going along with that too, it's funny, the U.S., like in the 2000s, the U.S. made much better gains relative to a lot of its like European counterparts and so on in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP, or especially if you focus just on the energy sector, not because of mandates and things like that, even though they did have that stuff in place, but just because of the innovations in hydraulic fracturing or fracking and horizontal drilling. And so it just made it a lot easier. There was a natural gas boom, and you can produce electricity with fewer emissions using natural gas than coal. And so that is an example of your point, where just let the market go. And a lot of times you achieve these other outcomes that these top-down government plans are ostensibly in place for. So, and you don't have the government's control over the energy sector if you go that route, which is another boost or another plus.
No, absolutely. And even coal, yes, natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel than coal is, but coal is remarkably clean today as well. And the only way the EPA was able to put a lot of coal power plants out of business was not by saying, hey, look, we're going to regulate how much arsenic or how much, you pick your pollutant, whether it's copper or sulfates or whatever. It wasn't by regulating all of those things and saying you can't put any of that into the atmosphere, because once those types of regulations weren't put in place, the coal plants simply adopted the same kind of technologies that Singapore uses when burning all of their trash, which is typically these electrostatic filters, which literally can filter the air coming out of a coal power plant so that it's cleaner leaving than it was coming in. Except that the EPA then turned around and did was they said, okay, we're going to limit how much carbon dioxide you can emit. Well, carbon dioxide is literally the byproduct of burning coal. And so by limiting that, you were limiting how much coal could be burned. And so you're not even limiting pollutants anymore. And it just goes to show you how the goals of these regulators is never really what they say it is. It's not about making the air cleaner. It's not about making things safer for consumers. No, it's about closing down the things they don't like. It's about shutting down their political opposition.
Yeah, I remember that there was a fight over labeling CO2 as a pollutant, and the people against that were like, that's what plants breathe. We talk, like it's
right. So, I mean, if CO2 is a pollutant, then you can reduce the number of CO2 by reducing the number of humans. Presumably, that's the next thing the EPA wants to regulate. I mean, think about that. If CO2 genuinely is a pollutant that is an existential threat to the planet, then it follows that you need to reduce the amount of CO2 that people are producing, which means you need to reduce the amount of people. I mean, it's literally a homicidal ideology. That's not an exaggeration. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but you simply just have to follow. But as soon as you get to one of these fallacies, just follow it to its logical conclusion, and then you can see how ridiculous it actually is.
Yeah, and I've had some people push back on that type of thing that you're saying there, EJ, saying, oh, well, no, but on net, if you're doing but it even if it were a matter of a life cycle thing, still, if you were going around and like throwing litter in some parks and then walking 3 blocks and then picking up some litter, you would still be littering in the first place. You know what I mean? So it doesn't matter. Like just if you're exhaling is emitting CO2, that if that's supposed to be a problem, then that's an issue. And you're not engaging in hyperbole because we can go, there's, not the EPA, but there's plenty of activist groups. People can go Google and look, and they would say there's way too many people on planet Earth right now. Now, they're not necessarily...
absolutely.
Yeah, they're not necessarily wanting everyone to go jump off a bridge, but it's, more like, oh, you got to, don't have more kids, and da-da-da. You think about what you're doing to poor Mother Earth, that sort of thing.
Right. The Malthusians for 50 years now have been saying that we need to reduce global population. Of course, they never want to reduce their own population, right? None of them are ever going to volunteer to take that long walk off a short pier. No, it's always other groups that they want to reduce their population. One of the things that is particularly scary, in my opinion, is the fact that very often this kind of dangerous ideology bleeds over, or I should say overlaps, with other very dangerous ideologies such as eugenics, where you will have groups of people who say, not only do we need to reduce the world's population, but we're going to focus on specific groups like blacks, for example, people in Africa, or others that are viewed as so-called undesirables. Exactly the same kinds of things that the Nazis and the Bolsheviks did in the 1930s, 40s, and beyond.
Yeah, it really is amazing for viewers who aren't familiar with this. I mean, just go look. The original progressive movement went hand in hand with eugenics because it makes sense too, right? It's not just like it was a coincidence that, if you're going to use the coercion of the government to steer the economy and to fix social conditions that way, so, force factories to clean their smokestacks and, have sewage. It also, if you care about like the genetic stock of the population, if you think in those terms, well, then why wouldn't you use coercion there as well, right? It all fits together in order to improve, to make society progress in their vision. So there's lots of famous people in the like progressive lineage who, if you go back, it's like awkward that, oh yeah, they were dabbling in eugenics or openly leading societies of it, like in the 1910s and what have you. So,
oh, absolutely. President Woodrow Wilson, I think, is a great example of that. One of, if not the leading progressive of his time, and also a big advocate for eugenics. I mean, let's not forget, things like the Ku Klux Klan had essentially been eliminated in America. Ulysses S. Grant, when he became president, led a charge to just wipe out that organization. And he was successful in doing so. And it was decades later that Woodrow Wilson resurrected it effectively by helping create a new organization that took on the same nomenclature and sadly produced a lot of the same results with things like lynching of blacks.
And that's not normally mentioned in his public descriptions of the great presidents of the past. Last thing I'll ask you here, EJ, and let you go, is can you comment? So some of the pushback against guys like you and me that I see, it comes from the financial sector like guys who watch the markets and they, maybe they have wealthy people that follow their podcasts or whatever, and they'll say, hey, I'm a free market guy. Maybe they call themselves libertarian, who knows what. I'm fans of the Chicago economist or the Austrian economist. But I'm just telling you, all this hand-wringing over the federal debt and, look at now the debt to GDP is this amount and blah, blah, blah. And they say, guys, you don't see it in the bond markets. If this really were a crisis, like you guys keep screaming about, how come yields on treasuries aren't, skyrocketing up? So people around the world with their own money on the line seem to think that the U.S. government, the Treasury, and is fairly fiscally responsible, right? So what would you say to something like that?
Well, I would say, first of all, I think the conservative movement broadly, I'm not saying you or I specifically, but the conservative movement broadly, I think, needs to do a mea culpa here, because for 40 years, different so-called conservatives, so-called fiscal conservatives, have been essentially playing Chicken Little and shouting from the rooftops that the sky is falling every time we hit, whether it was a certain ratio of debt to GDP, or when interest payments hit a certain dollar amount, when the debt crossed a certain threshold, whatever the case may be. And so they always created these fake lines in the sand where they said, once we cross this, it's over for the United States. Well, we've crossed every single one of those, and we're still here, and the economy is still ticking along. So why should anyone listen to so-called fiscal conservatives anymore? That's a very good question. That's a legitimate question. And I think the answer is because all of those folks, as hyperbolic as they were, as wrong as they were about the magnitude, they were right on the direction. Of course, this is unsustainable. The federal government cannot continue to forever spend more than it takes in. The problem is that this point of no return has proven different for different countries in different places around the world at different points in history. So it's not as if you can say the same numerical laws that applied to Weimar Germany or to Greece during the global financial crisis apply in the exact same way to the United States today. You just can't make that comparison. To a certain extent, it is apples and oranges. And so all we can do is caution that, look, we're right on the direction. The magnitude is the part of that is unknown, though. And I think that's all the more reason why we need to start turning this ship of state around as soon as possible, because it takes a long time to turn around. It's not as if you instantly throw the rudder over and you get the changes you want. It will take time. And furthermore, just because you hit a point of no return does not mean that the catastrophe happens instantly, right? There's a lag there. And that's where I worry that we may already be past that point of no return, where just the amount of money that the government has promised is already going to be spent, so-called mandatory spending plus interest on the debt. So no discretionary spending. Just the mandatory stuff is already more than the government takes in terms of tax revenue, which, by the way, right now as a percentage of the economy is at or near a record high. So it's not as if we can squeeze any more blood out of this stone. We just need to bring down government spending. But the problem is you're not even including any discretionary spending, including defense. None of that is even included in the deficit yet, and it's already a deficit. So can we ever get this thing under control? I'm not sure we can. And that's a very scary thought. And again, all the more reason why we need to try to turn this thing around as quick as possible. But the other thing I think is really important to remember is that this is not all a problem for future generations. This is not as if we are simply mortgaging our kids and our grandkids' future. We are. I mean, I don't mean to diminish that, but that's not the only thing that's happening here. Inflation is a tax. It is a transfer of wealth from the government, from the people to the government. You're taking money from the people and giving it to the government. There is no better definition than that for a tax, okay? That is what's happening today. If you're wondering, where did the government get the trillions upon trillions of dollars that they have spent on all of these blowout budgets? They are taking it out of your hide right now through the hidden tax of inflation. Every time you go out and you have to pay more for, you're putting groceries in the back seat, you're putting gas in the tank. Every time you go to the hardware store, wherever the case may be, and you're paying more, remember that you are paying the hidden tax of inflation. You are financing these massive government deficits today. It is a tax today paid by people today. It is the reason why your cost of living is through the roof and why your standard of living has come down so much. And so both of those are true at the same time. Yes, we are mortgaging our kids' future, but yes, we are also burdening ourselves today. And the further we go down this road of runaway government spending, the more you're going to have both of those effects. And I'm a firm believer that the 2% inflation target of the Federal Reserve is dead. Their target is now 3% plus. And we've arrived there. And there's no indication that we're going lower anytime soon. And what does that mean in the long run? It means every generation prices are going to double. Every generation. That's scary, but that's where we are. And I think it's important that we recognize that. We recognize where we are, because if we can't identify a problem, we're sure as heck not going to be able to fix it.
Well, with that sobering thought, I think we need to conclude. Folks, my guest has been E.J. Antoni, the research fellow with the Heritage Foundation. E.J., thanks so much for your time and your insights.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll put links. This is InFi episode 40 to some of EJ's work that we discussed, and we'll see you next time.
This concludes another episode of InFi, The Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.